Good evening and welcome. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all this evening to what is going to be a fascinating conversation that I have been looking forward to very, very much indeed. And, you know, it's very unusual for even a school of public policy to have two members of its faculty who have run for the highest office and done so well. And to do so and come back and teach afterwards and have great careers as academics beforehand. So I think we are enormously lucky to have Jan Svejnar and Andrés Velasco on our faculty. And tonight they will be talking to us about those experiences, what they've learned from them, and we'll have a chance to talk to them about the experience and how being an academic, being a great economist, helped them and perhaps also constrained them in as they sought to be presidents of the Czech Republic and Chile. What I'd like to do is very briefly introduce them, and then each will give very short presentations. Then we'll have really an exchange, which we very much look forward to. But let me just remind us of their amazing accomplishments. Of course, Professor Jan Svejnar, who will be speaking first, is the James Shotwell Professor of Global Political Economy and the founding director of our Center on Global Economic Governance here at SIPA. His research has focused on many different areas, including the effects of foreign investment and government policies on firms and workers, entrepreneurship, corporate, national, and global governance and performance. Issues the author of many books and has published widely in academic, policy, and practitioner-oriented journals. He has worked as an advisor to governments, nonprofit organizations, and firms, and serves as chair of the supervisory board of CSOB Bank and co-editor of Economics of Transition. He's also previously served as the founding director of the International Policy Center at the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy. And he has really a very long and illustrious career. Prior to joining us in 2012, he was at the University of Michigan. He also taught at the University of Pittsburgh and Cornell. He received his BS from Cornell and an MA and PhD from Princeton universities. So I think Jan has received many honors. But in 2012, let me note that he was honored with a Neuron Prize for Lifelong Achievement from an Endowment for Research and Science. And of course, in 2008, he was one of two candidates for the presidency of the Czech Republic. And that is part of tonight's discussion. Our second speaker is Professor Andrés Velasco, who was a presidential candidate in Chile more recently, 2012-2013. He came to that after being Minister of Finance between 2006 and 2010. And of course, during his tenure, he was recognized as Latin America's Finance Minister of the Year by several international publications. And he worked to save Chile's copper windfall and created what I'm told is a rainy day fund that was highlighted in the Financial Times, The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, and Bloomberg, among other sources. Since September 2013, he has been a professor of professional practice in international development here at SIPA, but previously, 2011-2012, Dr. Velasco was a Tinker visiting professor here at SIPA. He received a BA in Economics and Philosophy and an MA in International Relations from Yale, but he holds a PhD, importantly, from Columbia University. And he was a postdoctoral fellow in political economy at Harvard, and he taught at the Kennedy School, where he was a Sumitomo professor of development and international finance, an appointment he held since the year 2000. I could go on at some length, but as there are remarkable things to say about both Professor Velasco and Professor Svejnar, but with that, let me invite Professor Svejnar to lead us off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. It's a pleasure to give you a quick rundown as an introduction to what this experience was all about. First lesson, select your country well, where you're running for president. So I selected the most Central European country you can select, apparently. If you put a pin on Europe, it would be a few miles outside of Prague as a center of gravity. So if you want to control Europe, that's not a bad place to start where you are. So Czech Republic, population of about 10.5 million, roughly like Sweden, parliamentary democracy since the fall of the Berlin Wall, private economy, at that time relatively rapidly growing economy, parliamentary system. The chief executive is the prime minister, but the president has actually significant power, and for historical reasons, the Czech actually attach much importance to the office of the president. The president has a number of powers that I enumerate here. We can talk about it more later. Gets to nominate, is commander-in-chief, nominates the Supreme Court justices, members of the central bank board, and so on and so forth, and actually can attend meetings, and if he does, he presides, has the agenda-setting power. So it's actually quite a significant post, more than it's, say, in Germany or Austria. This is the prize, what my team calls the prize. You get to live in this castle. As I was telling everybody, that's where we'll have the great party if it were to happen. I could still be saying that in some sense, yeah. So it's the largest, really, palace that's used for day-to-day functioning of president of a country. My opponent was Vaclav Klaus, who was the incumbent. Long history in various capacities in the government. Founded an important right-of-center party, which actually committed to vote for him. The next to the last big bullet is my totally unbiased assessment of what he is about. But he did hold, which was very important for me, rather extreme views, extreme Eurosceptic. Some people would say he is a Europhobe, and has some extreme views like denying the very existence of global warming. So that, in some sense, was helpful for an opponent or a challenger, which I was at the time. I myself was somewhat handicapped. I left Czechoslovakia at the age of 17. I've worked intermittently in the Czech Republic, both in research, advisory, institution building type capacity. I started an American-style master's and PhD program in economics called CGEG. And in 2008, I was suddenly invited to stand, what they call stand, not run, but stand for presidential election. It's a parliamentary type election, so they said you'll just show up and we'll make sure you'll do well, and so it's not going to be a fiasco. You won't have to do the usual running for president that you have to do elsewhere. Well, as it turned out, I did, but that's another story that you'll hear. So here are the two opponents. The background. So as I said, indirect election, president is elected by the parliament. There are 281 parliamentarians. Klaus was controversial, as I mentioned, but very strong president. He announced already a year in advance that he would seek another term, and his party, in unison, said they would vote for him. So he had 122 out of the 141 votes that were needed right then. So to challenge somebody at that, you really had to sort of feel you could do a lot of damage in order to be able to win. I had the benefit of having international experience, which had significant value, but also potentially insufficient Czechness, not being there all the time. My presence was, as I mentioned, intermittent. I had some recognition, but nevertheless limited recognition by the public, and there were serious practical issues. How do you put together a team, get the financing together, and so on and so forth. The whole campaign actually took only 3 months, so this was a very, very quick, narrow window of opportunities. I was asked throughout the last 20 or at that point 17 years to join what was called a public life, be part of governments and so on. At one point, I was asked by President Havel, whom I served as economic advisor, to be an interim prime minister. But I actually resisted throughout this period to join in any of these capacities. But then on early November 2007, I was invited to become a candidate. I was stunned that nobody was willing to actually stand up against Klaus and provide another view, an alternative view, given how extreme his views were and dominant at the point. So I was asked by actually a broad spectrum. There was right-of-center independent senators. There was the Green Party that was in the middle and actually at that point part of a center-right government. And then the large party on the left of center, Social Democrats, joined in and invited me to join. The big question was, where would the Christian Democratic Party, which was also in the center, do? And then the Communist Party. Czech Republic still has a Communist Party, which actually is pretty much still in the Stalinist type tradition. In other words, it hasn't changed its name. It is not trying to say that it's totally parted from the past. It has important links to the past. The Christian Democratic Party disliked Klaus, but was divided on account of issue of restitution of church property, which was a big amount of money. And there was some hope that Klaus actually might give them those funds, which he didn't actually in the end. And communists claimed they didn't want Klaus, but they actually did help his election 5 years earlier. And Klaus did actually, in some sense, rehabilitate them by inviting them to his castle in the country during his events. So it wasn't clear which way they would go, and yet they were crucial. Which way they would go was obviously important. So I agreed to run. I spent November assessing support, assembling the team, decided to do a commando-type approach, given that Klaus had a huge machinery, large thing. So part of the strategy was to be quick, hit, run, set the agenda, make them react rather than set the agenda. I started putting pressure on Klaus. I challenged him to a public debate, which he refused, and that helped me enormously because he suddenly, this bionic man who seemed invincible, appeared like a coward who was not willing to go into a public debate. He hoped that he basically wouldn't give me visibility, but it only gave me visibility. And so within 1 month, actually, I caught up with him in opinion polls. So we are at 34% each, which was actually totally unexpected. Then, as it turned out, what I wasn't told was that the parliament would not be in session the 1 month before the election. So rather than just showing up in the parliament, I actually had to go and visit the members of the parliament in their hometowns. And being an American professor, I decided I would use the time to give lectures, which actually turned into huge public meetings with the citizens because they suddenly realized that this was a totally different approach than what was expected. I had to meet, obviously, with the Ecumenical Council, NGOs, the Cardinal, stage some events for the members of the parliament, had to enlarge the team from the small team that we had. Oh, and preparing campaign biography. This was very important. At one point, a key leader of the Christian Democratic Party asked me, where's your book? I said, what book? He says, well, Sarkozy wrote a book, you have to write a book. And I said, well, we're not planning on a book, but obviously, as I mentioned, the Christian Democrats were crucial. So we got a really very skillful journalist who did books in terms of interviews with Vaclav Havel and other people, and we met for 5 days, 2 hours each day. He would transcribe that same day what we talked about, and at the end of the week, there was a book. 5-chapter book. So I always tell my friends, so we as academics have the following schedule. A good paper, it'll take a year or more to write a good paper. Book, 5 years, 3 years, it really takes a while. Well, I do books in 5 days. And it was the bestseller at the time. In fact, it was, the book, except Harry Potter did better. I didn't know much about Harry Potter, but I was totally dejected that there was a book that was doing better at that point on the Czech market. But only one at the time. Okay. So, campaign program was ending transition from communism, basically turning the page on black and white view of the world. Klaus was very much in the traditional view. If you're not on my side of the barricade, you're on the other side of the barricade. You're with me or you're against me. So I was pushing much more of a tolerant view, colorful view of the world. An important part of the platform was looking forward rather than looking back, opening the country to the world, bringing Western standards, fighting corruption, which was more and more rampant, and many people in the government were part of it. And create consensus for economic reforms, which are very much needed, and that's where coming in as an economist gave me an edge. And then be a transparent partner for the next parliamentary election and contribute to the success of the Czech Republic, which was about to rotate in to be president of the European Union. Individual countries rotate in that capacity. So this will give you the view. This is the book here, the 5-day book right here. Of course, if you do a book, then you have to sign. So you have to participate in book signing events. And here was one of the spontaneous gathering of citizens in a district capital. And at times it was problematic because here there were so many people coming in that the fire limit was exceeded. But the journalists, of course, the media loved it. It was a big event. Klaus coming in, if you look at the red and blue together, was very strong, and his popularity was actually increasing. So by October 2007, he had essentially a 2/3, 66% favor. So the fact that in 1 month, suddenly we were down to 34 each was a big change in terms of what he expected. He was totally dejected, apparently, when at the end of December, he suddenly was down to even 34. There were a series of polls. The ones in pink, I think, are a little bit more objective. They happen to be in my favor. But as you can see, it was basically very even. But I like the last one the best. That was sort of before the election took place. Just a few words on how this election runs. Essentially, the election has 3 rounds. First round, if you were to win, you have to get the majority in each of the 2 houses, the 2 chambers. In the second round, you still have to get majority, but only of those present, not of every member. And in the third round, if nobody wins in the first or second round, all the votes are summed up, and majority of all those present, the winner is the winner of that. As it turned out, we had a whole day debate instead of voting whether the vote would be public or secret. And my supporters won in the end through an interesting rules that it would be public. And as it turned out, that was very important. The feeling was that the other side had more money and was going to buy votes. And when you have a public vote, everybody has to show up, and suddenly the amount of money for which you can purchase somebody would have to be quintuple or more in order to make it worth it. So we had 2 rounds, an impasse. We ran out of time. The next morning, we had a third vote, an impasse again. So we essentially went through an election where nobody won. And so that meant a week later, there would have to be a second election. My assessment is that this public vote was really crucial. It minimized the members of parliament crossing party lines. And the crucial thing was also the communists were unwilling to voting for me in the third round, and that, of course, had a negative effect on the hesitating voters who like to go with the winner. And so that, I think, were the important 2 things. This is how the voting looked. So I'm giving the speech before the first election. The preferences before the second election, most people want to have, again, public vote. They don't want the secret vote. Just don't trust the politicians at all. That they would. There was a poll which actually showed me ahead, 55 to 45, so that helped. And then we go into the second round. First 2 rounds, second election, First 2 rounds again repeated impasse, and then there is a crossing of party line on the part of a senior Social Democratic member of Parliament, and then one Green member of Parliament mysteriously absent, and communists in the end withdrew, abstained. Social Democratic, Christian Democratic votes were also important, and Klaus wins on the third round. Okay. So that's a little bit in that. The interesting things were the role of the communists. This is sort of historically the communists always had a question: would they go with a lesser evil or not? And I was clearly a lesser evil for them, but in the end, they just were not willing to go that route. So we could talk about why it was. There was an interesting set of intimidation sequence moves. MPs receiving bullets in envelopes. There was blackmail, buying of votes. The Christian Democratic Party, as I mentioned, was very much divided on account of restitution of church property. In terms of quick personal assessment, I thought this was really a unique way to offer public service to one's country, where I felt that country could really move ahead. It was interesting how you could gain support from population at large for policies and reforms that I was advocating at that point. As a result of all the manipulation and machination that took place and corruption, people demanded a change of constitution, which took place, and the next presidential election already was a direct election. And of course, you always have a chance to win. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Merit, for putting this together. I have learned a great deal already. I have learned that the Czech Republic and Chile both begin with C, actually with CH in Spanish. We have roughly the same population. We have roughly the same per capita income, but I have to note with great jealousy that you have a much better presidential palace. Ours is called a palace, but it's really a mint, and it is freezing in the winter. Prague Castle is really much nicer. Now, what I thought I would do is tell you a little bit about the campaign, but in particularly tell you about something that Jan and I discussed the other day as we were gearing up for this event. How different is academia from politics? And something that the dean wanted us to talk about, namely, if you are an academic, does it prepare you to be a politician? Or perhaps does it hinder you from being a politician? Are there things that I learned here that served my purpose as I was running for office? Or were there things that I learned here that I had to unlearn later on? And I'll get ahead. There were a little bit of both. So, just some facts before I get going. Fact number one, I participated in a presidential primary. The presidential primary took place in June of this year. Chile had never had nationwide presidential primaries, and we'd never had a law that governed such primaries, so we went American style and had one of these things. There was a great deal of uncertainty because no president, we had no idea how many people would vote. Pessimists were saying people don't care about politics anymore. The young, in particular, don't vote, so nobody would vote in this primary. That was the big source of uncertainty. I was also running against a formidable politician who had actually been my boss and who in about 2 weeks will be the president of Chile. She won the primary. Or let me put it this way, I lost the primary. I guess I wouldn't be here otherwise. Or if I would be here, but with guys in their ears with little things, But if this were football, I'd say that I was playing Brazil in Maracanã. So I knew I was playing I was competing against a remarkably skilled politician. I knew my chances were slim, but I thought that politics is sometimes about winning, but sometimes about winning by losing. Sometimes politics matters because you want to get ideas on the table, you want to ignite debates, you want to expand the range of the things that can be talked about. And to some extent, I was also fighting against the other politicians who were in the race. It was a 5-person race, and I knew that whoever came second would have a shot at the job next time around, and I'm happy to report that I did come in second. And even though I am an independent, and this is a little bit funny because what the hell is an independent doing in a primary? Well, this was a primary of a coalition, and the coalition allowed independents to run in the primary. And one of my achievements, I suppose, is that I beat all the other party members. There were 5 parties within the coalition. They all had their candidates. The Socialists won, but the Christian Democrats had a candidate. The Radicals, who were anything but radical, had a candidate. In fact, a bunch of other candidates out there with party machineries and party teams and money and the kinds of things I did not have. And I'm happy to report that I got quite a few more votes than any one of them. The party primary or the coalition primary was also a success. We had thought that maybe if 10% of those registered to vote voted, that would be a great achievement. It was more like 25%. About a quarter of the electorate showed up. So that made us happy. And presumably that means we will have more primaries of this kind in the future. So what is it like to be running for office? I have two answers to this. The first answer is that it's a lot of fun. It is by far the most electrifying thing I have ever done. If you want an excuse to not only get up in the morning, but to be charging ahead from 6 a.m. until 1 a.m. every day, 7 days a week for a year and a half, this is a very good way to get your energy going. And if you don't have that energy, you shouldn't be in this business. It is a lot of fun. And in case that sounds kind of timid, let me give you an example of how much fun it can be. A year ago, exactly a year ago to the day tomorrow, we launched our big summer campaign. The primary was in June. Mind you, this is in the southern hemisphere, something that Dan Quayle never quite got. In the southern hemisphere, it's warm in the month of February. And instead of being in the polar vortex of New York City, I was in central and southern Chile campaigning. You used the word American style. We didn't run an American style campaign, but we took one leaf from old-fashioned American campaigns. We got ourselves a Winnebago. And we started from Santiago, it's a long and skinny country, and we went south on a Winnebago. It was the middle of the summer, so where did we go? Town squares, beaches, every place where people gather in the summer. And this is a little bit of what it looked like.
You find a thing that gets you happy. You find your thing that gets you high. Pack your worries in a suitcase. Send them off and wave goodbye.
Ya, vamos con esta buena.
There's a choir that is singing. There's a song that must be sung. There's a rock and I'll be clinging until all my days are done. Until all the music is done.
So that's what it's like, ladies and gentlemen. That is to say, that's what it's like if it's the summer and it's warm and you have a Winnebago and a family willing to join you in the adventure. What did you see there? You saw a Winnebago. You saw a family. Very important. If you're going to go into politics, you better make sure your family wants to go along. For my 3 children, I hope it was the experience of a lifetime. They spent a month inside a Winnebago with both of their parents. And mind you, we slept there every night. Had we not, somebody would have leaked it to the press, and the press would have had a big headline that said, they're pretending to be sleeping in the Winnebago, but they're actually in a plush hotel. So yes, we slept there every night, father, mother, 3 kids. And given that reality in the modern world is a virtual reality, we tweeted from the Winnebago. We had little videos that we recorded and we put out from the Winnebago, and every campaign stop had, many activities that were up close and live, and many activities that were online. What else can I tell you? You need a firm stomach to run for president. You saw some takes there from Chanco, which is the Chilean capital of cheese. And if you go to a cheese fair and you don't sample the cheese, you will not be getting a lot of votes. So, you better like cheese, especially if you're going to cheese capital. It is also tricky to campaign with your children because your children, or anybody's children, say the truth, right? We had parked our Winnebago in the middle of a town square one day, and my daughter was very upset. I have a 4-year-old daughter. She was extremely upset because Daddy had promised to buy her a little color book early in the morning, and of course, I had been distracted. I hadn't gone to the store to buy the little book. So I'm in the middle of my speech. There are a couple hundred Chileans, Chilean voters in front of the Winnebago. I am in the most moving moment of my speech. My little daughter rolls down the window and screams, "Daddy, Daddy, you never keep your promises." Not something that you want to have happen in the campaign. Fortunately, the voters knew better. They knew that, of course, I do keep my promises. And that... So the first answer is, yes, politics is exhilarating. Politics can be fun. Politics and running for office can fill you with energy and a sense of purpose. That's answer number one. Answer number two, it is really hard. It is by far the most demanding, the most taxing, and the most difficult thing I have ever done. No offense meant to any of my former professors here. It was very hard to pass your exams, gentlemen. It was much harder to run for president. I hope you all understand that. It is demanding in a way that no other activity that I know of is. It is physically demanding, the kind of energy, the kind of endurance that it takes. It is intellectually demanding because you do have to be in command of many issues, and any misstep will be reported, and any stupid answer will be much discussed. And it is also demanding in that you have to be able to live with criticism in a way that even in the rarefied world of academia is unthinkable. I was telling the dean as we were coming up here that if you're in politics, at any point in time you can pull this out. You can go on Twitter and you can find, that maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe 20 people said very nasty things about you in the last half hour. If you can't live with that, you shouldn't be in politics. Let me get to the main question. Did I learn anything? As an academic, as a graduate student at Columbia University, as a professor at NYU and at Harvard, did I learn anything that was useful in becoming a public figure? And the answer is yes. There were many things that I learned. There were some predictable things that I learned. We teach our students here that clear thinking and an ability to reason is important. Yes, that is important. We teach our students, at least if you're an economist, that some basic concepts of economics are important. Opportunity cost, present value, a peso today is not the same as a peso tomorrow. All of that is important. It makes a difference to feel that you have the tools with which you can tackle an issue and say something coherent. There were two things that I found that I learned or that I had brought with me that were very useful, both running for office and, in fact, also being a minister. I had been a finance minister of Chile for 4 years. And those were the years of the crisis, when Lehman Brothers went down, when the world economy came crashing. That was not in my contract initially. Nobody had told me that I would be the Minister of Finance when the world economy collapsed, so that made it a great deal more exciting, also a great deal more demanding. And I found that there were two things that you have, or maybe you have, if you've been an academic, that help a lot. First, a sense of place. Most countries tend to think that whatever is going on in our country right now is entirely unique. No other nation has ever experienced such a thing before. And of course, that's rubbish. Most things have happened in other countries. Most things are happening in other countries. And, it was easy not to make this mistake this time around because you just, again, looked at your iPhone and the same things were happening in Colombia or in Mexico or in Singapore and in the Czech Republic, and the world was coming down. So a sense of perspective across countries at any given time is important. And if you're an academic, ideally you have some of that. Also a sense of perspective across time. I guess you could call it a sense of history. Most politicians and most voters tend to think that whatever's going on in any country at any given time has never happened before. It is all new. And of course, social media and media-driven politics of today leads us to think that, oh, this is all new. It's never happened before. And of course, that again is rubbish. It's happened in a different shape or form, but things have happened before. And to know what happened, to know what was done, to know what worked and what didn't, what are the lessons that you can learn, in my view, is extremely useful. So I guess I'm making a case for history here as part of the curriculum, if I may, Merit. Now, I also want to tell you about the things that I didn't learn. And there were many things that I didn't learn, probably too many things that I didn't learn. And rather than try to summarize it with my own words, I am going to plagiarize someone. There's a book out there that if you haven't read it, I'm going to recommend. It is called Fire and Ashes, and it was written by a friend of mine, a man called Michael Ignatieff, who, much like Jan and much like me, left academia in the United States to go run, not for president, but for prime minister of his native Canada. And he's actually, when I was at Harvard, he had an office 2 doors down, so we became pretty good friends. He left Canada after college, went to Harvard, went to the UK, etc., went back to Canada and had to face many of the same pressures and many of the same challenges you and I had to face. And he wrote a lovely book. He lost, and he's back at Harvard. And David Brooks just the other day in the New York Times reviewed this, and he summarized the differences between academia and politics in a way that is so cogent and so appropriate that I'm just going to paraphrase Brooks, and sometimes directly Brooks. First, the role of language. Language is entirely different in the way it is used in these hallowed halls from the way it is used in politics. As Brooks puts it, in academia you use words to persuade or discover. In politics, you use words to establish a connection. Many years ago, when I first began writing speeches for the finance minister of Chile, I wrote a speech for him in which I used the phrase economic reform. And he took me aside and he said, I was 22 at the time, he said, young man, in Latin America, if you say economic reform, you're a stooge of the IMF. We say economic transformation. And the difference between economic transformation and economic reform is a gigantic one. And again, if you don't get that sort of thing, you shouldn't be in politics. Difference number 2. In academia, the idea is to take a stand based on what you believe. In politics, the idea is to position yourself along a left-right axis in a way, and this is what really matters, in a way that will differentiate you from your opponents and help you win a majority. Politics in the United States, or in the Czech Republic, or in Canada, or in Chile is essentially tribal. You belong to a group, and the stances you take and the ideas that you advocate are ideas in and of themselves, are policy positions, but above all things, they're markers. If you say this, you belong here. If you say say that, you belong in the other group. And issues of identity are absolutely key, and we don't really understand that, at least not in the way we think about politics in academia. Let me quote Ignatieff - Brooks a bit more. In academia, the goal is to come up with a timeless truth. In politics, timing is everything, knowing when the time is ripe for a certain proposal. My students in the political economy class will recognize this. Timing, 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 timing. What is a good idea this morning at 10 a.m. may be a bad idea this afternoon at 4 p.m. And again, the time frame of academia, I'll take 2 years to write a paper and 5 years to write a book. By the way, I like the idea of a 5-day book. I may try that in the future. In academia, a certain false modesty is encouraged. In politics, you have to self-dramatize, concoct a story to show how your life connects to certain politics. Certain policies, vivid examples, life experiences. This is what it's all about. Abstractions, things that are hard to apprehend, are entirely and totally useless. And finally, in academia, you are rewarded for candor, intellectual rigor, and a willingness to follow an idea to its logical conclusion. In politics, all of these traits are ruinous. That's Brooks speaking, not me, not Ignatieff, but in fact, it is not too far from the truth. There are certain things that in politics you can say, there are certain things that you should say, and there are many things that you may think, but you should never say. And if you do, you will get into a great deal of trouble. And let me add one thing to that Ignatieff-Brooks list. In academia, passion is very much frowned upon. Especially in U.S. academia, you know, a little British touch, a little stiff upper lip is exactly the sort of thing that you should display from time to time. If you do that, you're going to be a lousy politician. In politics, even in Anglo-Saxon countries, mind you, this is not just a Latin phenomenon. Passion is absolutely everything. Passion is the fuel that politics runs on. A passionless politician is no politician at all. Now, what should you be passionate about? First of all, about the reasons for being in politics, the reasons for wanting to run. It is incredible how many candidates out there have been caught unaware by the media the first time they face a press conference. The obvious question is, why do you want to be president? Why do you want to be prime minister? Why are you in politics? Ted Kennedy faced this problem many years ago. So did Michael Ignatieff. He tells of his first encounter with the Canadian press. That's exactly what he was asked. Remarkably, he did not have an answer. What are the things that you should be passionate about? The reasons for being there, the changes that you may want to bring about, the differences you want to make. If you cannot express this with passion, again, you should be somewhere else, perhaps in academia, not in politics. And Michael says it very well, and I will end here. He says, politics tests your capacity for self-knowledge more than any profession I know. And he concludes, what I learned is this. The question of why you want to be a politician is a question about whom you want it for. In my case, whom did I want it for? Was it Canada? Was it my wife? Was it my mother? Was it my long-dead father? What were the passions that moved me to go into politics? That is the kind of statement that you will never, never, never hear in academia, but that is not a bad statement about what it takes to be in politics. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. That was a fantastic discussion, and I'd like to ask a few questions and then open it up. Well, I suppose the obvious question I'd like to ask is, both of you are men of great learning, and you've thought very deeply about economics. In the case of Andrés Velasco, you had I would say, the fortunate circumstance of having been able to run on your record, and a very, very successful record as a Minister of Finance, managing through a very difficult time. But I guess I'd like to ask you, what was the hardest part in terms of the trade-offs that each of you had to make running for office? Because clearly there was only a certain amount of appetite in the public for engaging on the substantive issues around which you would have to manage as president. Mm-hmm. So what are the difficult trade-offs? And I'm sure there were constituencies, as you describe, that had more levers to pull politically at home. You alluded to corruption, intimidation. You did not mention corruption and intimidation. So I'm wondering if you could each point to what you found to be the most difficult part of running for office in terms of engaging the public and feeling that in fact you could lead the country. Andrés, Jan, would you like to start?
Sure. So there are a number of issues here that I think are important. The one that, so first of all, I agree with what Andrés said, so I won't repeat some of the things that he mentioned, but they apply equally well in the Czech context and I think other contexts as well. The one thing is not to look for fairness and symmetry. That in some sense we're in the academic world used to everybody gets a fair share, everybody gets the same amount of time, so to speak, and so on. That's not something that you should necessarily expect on the part of the press, media, people in general. You have to fight for getting the attention, getting what you deserve, and blame only yourself in some sense if you don't succeed, and realize that the world is not fair. Especially so in my case, I was challenging an incumbent. And in a traditional situation, the incumbent would be kind of given a better shake. And I felt that that should not be the case. We're both candidates, and I should be getting the same treatment by the media as he is. And it took until, in fact, I caught up with him or started leading in the polls that I started getting more or less equal treatment. And so I think this was one recognition that was, really, really important. The other, I think, which is kind of a good lesson from the academic world, which was very helpful, that if you can explain things very simply to people and you make sense, it is highly appreciated. So in some sense, they said, he's an economist, but he is able to speak better than economists, because I was really making sure that, I was speaking
underhanded praise
in very, very, very plain, simple language, And as you say, it has to be, there has to be compassion with it. So depending the audience, you have to go at the level that's appealing to them. And I had, for some reason, great appeal to older ladies. I don't know why, but you take any vote you can, right? So that was perfect.
Actually, my answer is going to be very, very similar. You asked about trade-offs. Yeah. And of course, as an economist, I could list a million trade-offs that we had to worry about. But I would summarize my answer thus. The hardest thing is to introduce the concept of trade-off in a public policy discussion. I'll give you a couple of examples. We had big discussions about the minimum wage. An economist is trained to think that minimum wage is a good thing, but too much of a good thing is a bad thing. You increase it too much, you will lose jobs. Try making that argument in a union hall, and people will say, we are entitled to jobs and to better wages. And the fact that, one might have in the back of one's mind something called an elasticity is not going to cut any mustard. We had discussions about healthcare. Of course, healthcare in the US or in Chile is very expensive. So, do we focus on shorter waiting times, or do we focus on higher quality once you get to the head of a queue? An economist will think, well, we have to choose or to trade off. People want good quality care, and they want it when they're sick, not next year, not 2 months from now. So introducing the idea of a trade-off is in fact something that is very difficult. And in fact, Jan said that the hardest thing was to communicate. I think communications is by far the biggest challenge you face as a minister and as a candidate. We had this rainy day fund that you mentioned. We were saving money during times of very high copper prices. Because we understood that someday, we didn't expect it to be so soon, but someday there might be a crisis, copper prices might crash, and we would need the money. I struggled for over a year trying to explain how do you say that in plain Spanish, and how do you say it in the plain Spanish that fits the circumstances. I don't know how it is in the Czech Republic, but I found that the best time of the day to go on TV is early in the morning. That's sort of the Chilean equivalent of the Today Show, right? Who watches the Today Show? Well, until about 8 a.m., it's people of all ages, men and women, but then when a lot of the men go to work, there are more men working and there are more women at home. So you're basically addressing, again, older ladies, very important voters. Yeah. And I, after trying a dozen different phrasings, I came across the most obvious one. I would say, we are doing to the country's finances exactly what you do with your family finances. If your husband or you earn a little bit extra money one year and you know that money may not, be around next year, what are you going to do? Are you going to spend it all in 1 year? Of course not. You're going to save some of it. And I would add, of course, if your husband is the one who's getting the money, the first thing that you do, of course, is you take it away from him, right? Because men are completely irresponsible and women are much more responsible in running the family finances. You do that, of course, in the middle of this morning talk show, and you're squeezed between the aerobics class and the cooking class, and they're saying, Minister, please hurry up because we've got to fry some eggs, right? So brevity is also of essence, and it's very hard to do.
Let me ask you one other question I'm quite curious about, and that is, both of you spent a bulk of your adult lives in the United States. You were trained in the United States, you were tenured in American universities. And yet you went home and were hugely popular, in your own countries. How is that? I mean, were you not seen as Americans running in Chile, an American running in the Czech Republic? Is that, should we draw from that the United States remains popular in the world? Did you have to distance yourself from the United States? How does the U.S. component of your backgrounds fit into your experiences as running for a presidential office? Could you start us off?
Sure. I said in my remarks that one of the keys to running for anything is that you have to tell a story, and one of the stories you have to tell is your life story. And this was a key part of my life story, but I had to tell it the right way, because other people were going to try to tell it the wrong way. What was the right way? I came to the United States at age 16 as an exile. My father was kicked out by the Pinochet dictatorship. I arrived in a public school in LA. People didn't like me. I had a terrible time, and lo and behold, I ended up in an Ivy League school. It's a long story. I won't bore you with it. But the essence of the story was I left my country against my own will, and I worked my little butt off, and I did okay, and now I'm back. So that's a story that could be told in many ways. And part of your job is to make sure that it's told the way you want it to be told, and the way that you feel is right, given what you did. Now, you also asked, is the U.S. a big issue, a non-big issue? I hate to break the news to you guys, but the U.S. doesn't get talked about much, at least in my part of the world. There used to be a time in Latin American politics where the good things, had to do with the U.S. and the bad things had to do with the U.S., whatever. And if you read the New York Times, you think that that is still the case. Wrong. Wrong. I was a minister for 4 years. I went to London maybe 3 times a year. I went to Madrid 3 times a year. I went to Sao Paulo 5 times a year. I think I went to Washington maybe once a year. Not a big issue one way or the other.
Very interesting.
Yeah, no, so I would agree with that. It's exactly that. I had somewhat of a additional problem. I mentioned briefly, you may have noted that I was supported by a very broad coalition from right to left, and so it was an exercise in diplomacy. How do you keep all those guys happy at the same time? And really, the rightmost senators wanted to outlaw the Communist Party, and the leftmost Social Democrats were the ones who were the link to the communists, between the Social Democrats and the communists. And so it was very, very difficult, and at times there were situations where I had to kind of calm everybody and explain why I couldn't do certain things. With the U.S., it came in because that was a time when, some of you may recall, the U.S. was thinking of establishing anti-ballistic silos in Poland, and across the border in the Czech Republic there would be a very powerful radar. This thing happened to be very unpopular at the time. People simply did not comprehend the larger scheme of things, wasn't very well explained. Also, they were worried that these countries would be then a target of retaliation. The Russians were pushing very hard. And so there was an interesting sort of decision that I had to make, and I made, where I stood on principles, saying, look, this is important to do. Let me explain to you why. When I was talking to people, we agree on most issues, as you can see here, and it's important to understand when we disagree, and you want a leader who can stand up for certain things. And usually I manage to neutralize the opposition in the room that immediately developed towards me. And that was, I think, one of the most difficult situations, and that's where the Americanness was a liability. Otherwise, it would be actually an asset in the post-Soviet setup. But obviously, the opponents were using the lack of what I call Czechness. This guy doesn't understand what's happening here, and so on. So it was a burden to persuade that, in fact, I was good both in things Czech and things international. And I was stressing, and everybody on my side was stressing very much that I was bringing in expertise, bringing in breath of fresh air, and so on and so forth. And it happened to coincide with Obama's campaign, Yes, We Can, the change idea. So that was perfect because it kind of played in to my campaign slogans.
Well,
I should add that once in a parliamentary debate, a senator in the midst of a speech got carried away, and he said the Minister of Finance will one day go back to Harvard and leave Chile sinking in a sea of excrement. Fortunately, the gentleman lost his bid for re-election. A much-deserved loss, if I may add.
Well, we're going to open it up, but let me first invite, we invited a special guest. I think we have a microphone going to, if you could come around to the front. A special guest with us tonight. I think both of our faculty members here, Professor Svejnar and Velasco, ran very transparent campaigns. And I think in the case of Andrés, you also were quite actively involved in social media, and probably more so than any other candidate I've read to be the case. And we invited a special guest tonight, Thomas Gensimer, who was very much involved in designing and running President Obama's first social media campaign very successfully. And so I thought, Thomas, you might start us off from the perspective of social media and running campaigns.
Sure, certainly. Thank you for the introduction. Nice to meet you both earlier, too. My first question was on how does your experience make you change the way you view campaigns happening? One, the level of transparency, but also just the personal experience of having put yourself and your families through it. How do you view politics around the world? And I think in particular, when we think of President Obama, probably the biggest friendly critique people would have was they describe him as professorial. Yes. And in the context of today's conversation, how do the pluses and minuses of that? It's like, do you curse someone for being thoughtful and schooled versus overly pulled by passion? But particularly with social media and the transparency it brings, how do you view that as how do you look at campaigns now, having gone through the experience yourself?
Yeah. So I found the campaign exhilarating, just like Andrés said, and extremely demanding. I would say that I've learned one important thing, which was already mentioned also, but I think is worth stressing, that in a way the first and most important thing is to not make a mistake. That you say something that you may later regret, and there's no way to take it back. So a successful day for me was a day when I made no errors. Mm-hmm. And then you sort of learn to be totally relaxed and casual, or look as such on top of that. But you always have to be there because the media people and everybody are just trying to trip you, come up with questions and so on. And you have to be sort of ready to smile back, even if it's the toughest of questions, mm-hmm. and basically avoid making an error or judgment or anything like that. So that, I would say, from the experience was the thing. But otherwise, I think the campaign, I found it that the family, just like your family, was very supportive, very good. I was amazed how my daughter, who was the younger child, how she actually proved to be more adept probably than I was campaigning, in the sense that the journalists at one point really cornered her and asked questions like, well, how's your dad when he is mad at you? What does he do? They were trying to find some negative features. And she says, like every other dad, no different. Yeah. And I thought that was a really good answer, that we didn't practice with her at all. And she just understood that she was not to reveal whatever might be harmful. There was nothing to reveal, of course, but...
No, that's exactly right. The degree to which modern campaigns leave no stone unturned is by now kind of a cliche, but it's one thing to know about it, something else to live through it. Two examples. About halfway through the campaign, we got a professional driver because campaign volunteers were not doing a great job of driving the campaign cars. So professional driver, one good day, leaves the car with two wheels on the sidewalk, two wheels on the street. And I get out. I had not been out of the car for 30 seconds when somebody had taken a picture of this, and I was already up on Twitter, right? So, I am about to give a press conference, and my press chief comes up to me and says, we have a situation. What's the situation? Look at the car. And there were maybe 30 tweets already. Maybe 3 minutes had gone by. So something as minor as that, this was not a big avenue in the middle of town. It was in the middle of nowhere. Becomes a liability. So children, yes. On the day of the election, I went with my son, who's 4. And one of the things that I had made a big deal of during the campaign is that I'm a big fan of a certain football team in Chile. So as I, approached the voting place with my son, the press they come running up, and one of them, with an evil intention, goes up to my son and says, "Does your dad really like that team that much?" Hoping that my son would say, "Oh, no, he really likes some other team," right? Which would have lost me, 500,000 votes or something. But my son was reliable. He said, "Yes, of course, he does," and he watches every match, etc. So, things like that. Now, transparency. We were the first campaign ever in Chilean history to post a list of people who had given us money, even when we were not obliged to by election law. Election law in Chile is very tough, but only during the last 3 months when you're officially campaigning. But of course, you don't campaign only for 3 months, you do so for a year and a half. And as a result, before those 3 months, it's pretty much a free-for-all. Even outside the legal period, we posted lists with, amounts, names, et cetera, that got us a lot of positive attention because people say, something new is happening. And there are a bunch of NGOs out there who, were very active on social media demanding that different candidates uphold certain standards. We were the only ones who did it, etc. So that helped. But, of course, it sounds nice. You have to be prepared to do it. And you have to be able to talk funders into saying, yes, I do want to appear, et cetera, and it's not easy.
Yeah, and I would just add, we did the same thing. We had all expenses, right, on the website out there. And so at one point, actually, the prime minister at the time, who was Klaus' supporter, accused me, he put it very delicately, of being in a corrupt environment. And so we immediately had to retaliate and basically said, no. He spoke about some occasion where we hosted some members of parliament to a lunch. So we put all the expenses right there and said if his number were correct, then a sandwich would have cost $200 instead of whatever it cost, $2. Mm-hmm. We started calling it after his name, Topolanek sandwich. So immediately turned it around. That's the kind of sandwich he has every day, etc. And so you had to be right there. But it is true that if you ever want to get a check on your private life, go for a campaign, because everything will come out. So things you don't remember will be found and everything. So that's the
and
best
things that
way
you do remember. I was prepared to be asked the question, did you ever smoke marijuana? And of course the question came, and I said yes, of course I did. In college. Not at Columbia University, Dean, don't worry. I was at college elsewhere. And of course, I was ready to, have people give me a hard time. And I called my wife and I said, I admitted to smoking pot. Let's be ready for it. Nobody cared. Nobody noticed. Not a single line was written about it, which I guess says something about social change in Chile.
Absolutely.
One more, and then I don't want to monopolize. The weight of expectation, now given the level of transparency and access that candidates have, we're looking here in the city of Mayor de Blasio, who ended up through a sort of primary process that he was the great white hope of the progressives, not only here in the city, but across the country. And in fact, public polls came out a couple of weeks ago realizing that a lot of people don't realize the differences between the state budget and the city budget and what he really can have control of. When you expose yourself to such a long process and an exhaustive one with the electorate, and you both sort of mentioned you were the only independent amongst, but you then had a coalition, several people asked you to run. Naturally, you find yourself maybe not making promises, but agreeing with people, be it in the union hall or otherwise, that would be your natural coalition. Imagine your next campaigns when you are both become president or prime ministers, the weight of expectation that then falls on, be it the president or be it our mayor or other things. How does that play into your internal thoughts as you run and as you deal with that reality?
Well, I think there is a principle in sort of campaign 101, whenever it gets taught here, which is there are two kinds of campaigns. So those that you run when you think you have no chance of winning, and those that you run when you think you have a chance of winning. When you have a chance of winning, that becomes very problematic, right? Because people get tempted to promise, and if you know that you're going to be actually be held up to those promises, then you may be in trouble. And the problem is that the campaign dynamic is such, and time horizons are such, that what matters is what you say in the next 24 hours. The election seems a year away, and actually, the day when you might be sworn in seems like ages away. So way too many people fall into that trap. I'll tell you what we did in that respect. Given that I was a finance minister before, I knew that people would be double careful with anything that I talked about that involved money or numbers. So I tried to be very consistent and very prudent on that. I did take what were fairly bold stances on things that I guess in American parlance you'd call value issues. I was the first person to come out in favor of gay marriage in the history of Chilean politics, as far as I know. Legalization of pot. I took a liberal view toward relations with our neighbors, which are always a little bit shaky. And on those kinds of issues, people told me that I would lose a lot of votes, and it doesn't seem to have happened. And the polling we did suggests that there were lots of middle-class centrist voters willing to go along with those more liberal positions. But yes, the issue of overpromising is an ever-present one, and one that comes back and bites you if you have the fortune of winning.
Yeah, so I obviously face the same set of issues. Maybe one thing that was somewhat easier, given that everybody realized that I had such a broad coalition, then members of the coalition had to control themselves, not pushing their partisan view on me, realizing that they needed the others if they were to succeed in getting me elected. Nevertheless, I think their leadership was very important because at some point I remember there were a group of social democrats, fairly highly elevated people who said, look, you have to give the communists something. You just have to yield on some of these issues. But the very top leader of the party came and said, no, we don't have to agree on everything. You stay your course. And that was very important. I wouldn't have done it anyway, but his blessing of it was very important. And with the Christian Democratic Party, I had also a relatively liberal stand on a number of issues, including abortion, for instance. And so there was a wing of the party that just instinctively was against me. But I was compensating for it by stressing the anti-corruption, the high ethical standards, moral sort of, etc., which was very much what they stood for. So I was able, I think, within that sort of get an acceptance, not enthusiasm, but acceptance.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just collect, I think, one or two questions, if we could collect from at least a couple students, and then let you both respond right here. Yeah.
Thank you very much. A quick question following Professor Velasco's presentation. So for whom did you want to be in politics, if you can tell us both? And also, you both belong to the more the left-hand side part of the political spectrum, more or less. So I guess it has to do with something about social change or fighting for social equality. But precisely given your academic and elitist background, did you feel during your campaign a problem of connection or communication with more common uneducated people or weaker social groups? And if so, how did you try to manage and to address it?
You talked a lot about how academics influence you in politics. I want to ask you the other way around. Do you think that after having gone into politics, you gained certain knowledge that today is useful for your academic work? You're writing your next political economic paper, you're going to take some knowledge that you wouldn't have been able to find elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. One question down here.
Thank you. My question is that we saw a lot of technocrats take over as prime ministers and presidents of their countries, especially during the financial crisis in Europe. Do you see technocratic leaders being the way forward, or is it just like a phenomenon that you see during financial crisis?
So I'd like to invite you both to answer these questions, but let me add one to the list, which is only what do you want to convey to our students about the experience? I mean, we are training the next generation of leaders. I think we want you to convey to them a little bit about what lessons you've learned that you think they should be engaging as future leaders from this experience. So an invitation for closing comments around this range of matters. Jan, would you like to
Sure.
say this?
So for whom, etc. So I had a sort of personal goal, which goes back to when I left the country at the age of 17. I didn't want to leave. I left after the Soviet invasion. No plan of mine. It was kind of a fatalistic event. And so I figured, maybe one day I can come back and help the country do better. So for me, that was part of that dream, if you want, mission. That was all the way. And so that's what really guided me. For many of the Czechs, I was an enigma, which I think I dispelled into a positive solution in the sense that, as you say, I had strong social feeling because in terms of economics that we do here, we often apply it to public policy where we try to improve welfare, right? And at the same time, I was an economist, right, which for them sort of didn't make sense. As an economist, you argue for markets, so you must be conservative, but on the other hand, you have all these social ideas, how could you, right? So that was sort of a goal, but was part of that. Going from politics to academics, I realized as I was talking to all these members of the parliament that most of what economists were talking about was way above their heads, that they just basically did not follow any of that. So the first thing I did afterwards was within the academic center that I started there, I created part of it that was like a public think tank that is doing analyses and presenting results at the level the policymakers can really handle because they could not. So that, I think, was a very important both theoretical lesson, but also in practice. In terms of the technocrats, I think that, and that leads naturally to what Merit mentioned, I think that we'll see more and more politicians who are relatively well educated, have more, if you want, technocratic or analytical background. Obama himself, I think, is a good example in the sense that he had experience, short stint, but nevertheless stint at the University of Chicago and so on, etc. So I think we'll see more and more of that, and people who are, in some sense, doing what the Brits have coined and now around the world, evidence-based policy, right, where you do policy in terms of based on data analysis and so on. Basically, the curriculum that we have here is the predisposition for that. And so I think that really the education you get here as students is exactly the right one. And I would add to it what's really important is to have an incredible amount of energy, enthusiasm, and a healthy dose of idealism. That you need to go into it. It's kind of like combining the academic education and the American sports team approach, right? We're going to win this no matter what, right? And then you go. And so, again, journalists were flabbergasted when they were telling me at the beginning, look, we are like the David against the Goliath. You have no chance here. And I said, no, I'm going to win. And they said, well, what are you going to do when you lose? And I said, well, nobody on my team is ever thinking about it. We just, that's not an idea that we at all entertain. And I think that's really the important thing, is that you can accomplish quite a lot. Obviously, I didn't win, but it was much closer than I thought. I mean, I thought if I get 30% and he gets 70% of the votes, that's very decent showing. The fact that I forced him to go into a second election and only on the last round through a visible buying of votes, there was an outcome that went that way. Just was beyond, but it was part of this. And the team, the commando, I should mention, having a team is terrific. Select your team very carefully. And I had a terrific, very well selected team, and it accomplished, with small numbers, accomplished incredible amount.
Thank you very much. Andrés.
Thank you. For whom did I want to do this? I wanted to do it for a generation. This was a generational campaign. Chile is a country that since the transition to democracy in 1990 has been run pretty much by one generation of people. And those who are of my age and younger want something different, and they want something better. It's a little bit indicative of the state of a country's politics that you can be over 50, which I am, and still be called a young politician. It just points out that most of the other guys were, even less young. And I did it also for the dream of a country that in Latin America can make it. A century ago, Latin America was the promise of the world. A century later, we are the forgotten corner of the world. You know, the guy who's the Economist editor for Latin America wrote a book called Latin America, The Forgotten Continent. And there have been so many moments and so many countries and so many episodes of nations in Latin America that seem that they would make it. What do we might make it? Become democratic, become developed, become fair, become less unjust. And we have failed. We failed again and again and again. And it seemed to me, and it seems to me, that Chile today is a country that has a pretty good shot at making it in all those respects. And if we do, we would be, it would be a great thing for our people. It would also be a great thing for the continent. Did I feel that because I was an academic, I had difficulty communicating with the little old lady at the feria? A lot of Chilean politics happens at feria, street markets. On a Saturday morning you go and people are buying their tomatoes and their corn. No. Far from it, for a number of reasons. And here, in fact, having spent many years in the U.S. may have been a help. Why? Because American culture is more horizontal. Many Chilean politicians will pass themselves as men of the people, and I say men because they're mostly men, but truly they think that the voters are the scum of the earth and that they're way, ahead of them. And the fact that I was informal, and I wasn't informal because I was deliberately informal. I was informal simply because that's the way I had been living my life, And in the U.S. or in American academia, pomposity is out, and social barriers are not things that people welcome, and you don't ask to be called sir or your excellency or anything of the sort, right? So. In fact, it may have been, in fact, a help. And communications were also important. I was very driven, I was very focused on the idea that there was no issue that was so complicated that could not be explained in simple words. And we worked hard on that. We would write drafts of speeches 8 times, and we would work on, materials for ads and stuff like that, 12 times until it was in plain Spanish, and we spent a lot of time on focus groups, testing stuff, is this understandable? Is it comprehensible? Are the sentences short? By the way, another good bit about an American education, short declarative statements, short sentences, not long, flowery prose, so typical of Latin American politics. Besides, if you're going to do, 140 characters, it better be brief, right? So I had a good time. Besides, I had really had a good time. I went to, probably 5 ferias a day, every day for a year and a half. My wife worried that people would throw tomatoes at me. I'd been the finance minister. Finance ministers are the bad guys in the story. Not a single tomato was hurled at me. I regret to report. One guy threw a balloon full of water at me, but it was a wimpy throw. It landed over there. It was the only time that I had anything resembling aggression. In fact, the police protection guys at the very end of the campaign said to me, sir, we were really hoping to go into action, but unfortunately, we saw no opportunity. It was a highly civilized campaign. It was a campaign without violence of any kind. Technocrats. I have to admit, I hate the word. And I hate the concept because I think it's a very misleading concept. When you speak about technocrats, there's a sense that, they are politicians who are, guys who eat too much pizza and who, chomp on cigars and with no education. And then there are technocrats who are svelte and all-knowing and have, calculators in their heads. And that's a really misleading way of characterizing politics. A good public servant, a good public leader, a good politician is a little bit of both. Is somebody who can, have pizza and also speak in short declarative sentences and make sense. If I think of the political leaders that I admire, whether in the U.S. or Europe or Latin America, they are a little bit of both. They're people who can speak and, and make sense, but who also are not pompous, who are accessible, who are fun, people with whom you'd want to have a beer, as I guess that's the classic test in American politics. Did I learn things that would help me write papers in academia? Very much so. I had done a stint in the Chilean finance minister in the early 90s, and I came back to the U.S. as an academic. 80% of the papers I wrote are about my experiences. If you read the papers, you'd never be able to tell because they're models with lots of equations. But the motivation, the issue, the willingness to understand or the interest in understanding something made a big difference. Lessons for students. Guys, if you're thinking about it, go for it. Politics is a hard calling. It's tough. It can be very unfair. And particularly, it is very tough because you have very little control over outcomes. You know, in most professions, you have some sense of the relationship between what you put in and you get out. You have some sense that if I do this, and if in academia, you know, if I write 3 papers a year for 9 years, 27 papers, they've got to give me tenure, right? If they're, you know, reasonable papers. In politics, you have absolutely no clue, forgive the economics jargon, of what the production function looks like. You know, there are inputs and there are outputs, and they're entirely unrelated. And an election can be stolen away from you, or one mishap, one misstatement, one awkward moment, and you're gone. So in that sense, it is tough, it is demanding, it is difficult. On the other hand, it is truly exhilarating. As a friend of mine put it to me, you know, he said, we were on the cabinet together, he said, I have never done something where I could come home every day and say to my children, I did something useful today. And that is a tremendous feeling. Now, don't go into it before thinking long and hard. Think long and hard of why you want to do it. Don't do the Ted Kennedy thing. Don't be caught without an answer. Secondly, make sure that a little introspection reveals to you that the motivations are right. Namely, I want to serve my country and not wrong. You know, I want to avenge my long-lost father. That sounds very noble, but it isn't. People are not interested in your existential problems. People are not impressed by the fact that you want to be a politician because, you know, you're trying to show your father that you're not a good for nothing. That does not cut any mustard with anybody. You have to be sure that you can explain to people what it is that you want to do and why you want to make a difference. Last but not least, make sure that your family is on board because it is an extremely taxing exercise for the whole family. And if they don't want to come along for the ride, you better not go there. Thanks very much.
Wonderful discussion. Thank you both so much.